Good evening. This is the Midnight Audio channel. Tonight we will present a complete version of Natsume Soseki's 10 Nights of Dreams, which we have previously presented, all connected into one video. A long and mysterious dream journey that continues from the first night to the 10th night. Please take your time and enjoy this strange world until you fall asleep. 10 Nights of Dreams. Natsume Soseki. First night. I had a dream like this.
As I sat by the pillow with my arms crossed, the woman lying on her back said in a quiet voice,
"I am going to die soon." The woman had spread her long hair across the pillow and laid her soft, oval-shaped face within it. A warm blood color subtly flushed beneath her pure white cheeks, and the color of her lips was, of course, red. She did not look at all as if she were about to die. However, the woman clearly stated in her quiet voice, "I am going to die soon." I, too, felt certain that she was going to die. So, looking down at her, I asked, "Is that so? Are you going to die soon?" "I am indeed," the woman said, opening her eyes wide. They were large, moist eyes, and inside the long eyelashes, it was entirely pitch black. Deep within those pitch-black pupils, my own figure floated vividly. I gazed at the luster of those black eyes, which looked so deep they seemed transparent, and wondered if she was really going to die, even so. Then, gently bringing my mouth close to her pillow, I asked again, "You aren't really dying, are you? You'll be all right, won't you?" At this, the woman, keeping her black eyes sleepily wide, replied in the same quiet voice, "But I am going to die. It cannot be helped." "Well then, can you see my face?" I asked intently, and she smiled sweetly, saying, "Can I see it, you ask? Why, it is reflected right there, isn't it?" I fell silent and pulled my face away from the pillow. Crossing my arms, I wondered if she really had to die after all. After a while, the woman spoke again. "When I die, please bury me. Dig a hole with a large pearl oyster shell. Then place a fragment of a fallen star from the heavens as my tombstone. And please wait by the grave, for I will come to see you again." I asked, "When will you come to see me?" "The sun will rise, won't it? Then the sun will set. Then it will rise again, and it will set again, while the red sun falls from east to west. From east to west. Can you wait for me?" I silently nodded. The woman raised her quiet tone a notch and said in a resolute voice, "Please wait for 100 years. For 100 years, please sit by my grave and wait. I will surely come to see you." I simply answered, "I will wait." Then my figure, which had appeared so vividly within her black pupils, softly began to blur. Just like still water moving and disturbing a reflection, it seemed to flow away. And then the woman's eyes snapped shut. Tears spilled from between her long eyelashes onto her cheeks. She was already dead. I then went down to the garden and dug a hole with a pearl oyster shell. The pearl oyster was a large, sharp shell with a smooth edge. Every time I scooped the earth, the moonlight shone on the back of the shell and sparkled. There was also the smell of damp earth. It was not long before the hole was dug. I placed the woman inside it. Then I gently covered her with soft earth from above. Every time I cast the earth, the moonlight shone on the back of the pearl oyster shell. Then I picked up a fallen star fragment and placed it lightly on top of the earth. The star fragment was round. I thought that while it was falling through the vast sky for a long time, its corners must have worn off, making it smooth. As I lifted it and placed it on the earth, my chest and hands grew slightly warm. I sat on the moss. Thinking that I would be waiting here like this for 100 years, I crossed my arms and gazed at the round tombstone. Before long, just as the woman had said, the sun rose from the east. It was a large red sun. Then again, as the woman had said,
It eventually set in the west. It fell heavily, still entirely red.
1, I counted. After a while, the crimson sun sluggishly rose again. Then it silently sank away. 2, I counted again. As I went on counting 1, 2, in this manner, I lost track of how many red suns I had seen. Even though I counted and counted, countless red suns passed over my head. Yet 100 years still had not come. In the end, gazing at the moss-covered round stone, I began to think that I might have been deceived by the woman. Then from beneath the stone, a green stem grew diagonally toward me. As I watched, it grew longer and stopped just about at my chest. The next moment, at the top of the slender swaying stem, a single long narrow bud that had been slightly tilting its head plumply opened its petals. The pure white lily smelled so sweet right before my nose that it pierced to my bones. Just then, a drop of dew fell from high above, and the flower swayed and moved under its own weight. I leaned my head forward and kissed the white petals, dripping with the cold dew. Just as I pulled my face away from the lily, I involuntarily looked into the distant sky and saw a single morning star twinkling. 100 years had already arrived. I realized for the first time at this moment.
Ten Nights of Dreams. Natsume Soseki. Second night. I had a dream like this. Leaving the priest's room and returning to my own along the corridor, I found the paper lamp burning dimly. As I rested one knee on the cushion and turned up the wick, a flower-like piece of charred wick fell with a soft thud onto the red lacquered stand. At the same time, the room suddenly became bright. The painting on the sliding doors was by the brush of Buisson. The black willows were painted thick and thin, near and far, and a cold-looking fisherman was passing along the bank with his bamboo hat tilted. In the alcove hung a scroll of Monju of the Sea. The unburnt remnant of a stick of incense was still smelling in the dark corner. Because it was a vast temple, it was dead silent and completely deserted. The round shadow of the round paper lamp cast on the black ceiling looked as if it were alive the moment I looked up. Keeping one knee raised, I lifted the cushion with my left hand, slid my right hand under it, and found it exactly where I thought it would be. Knowing it was there gave me peace of mind, so I adjusted the cushion back as it was, and sat down heavily upon it. As you are a samurai, there is no reason why you cannot attain enlightenment, the priest had said. He had added that since I was taking so long to attain enlightenment, I must not be a samurai. You are the scum of humanity, he had said. Ah, so you are angry, he had laughed. If you are frustrated, bring me proof of your enlightenment, he had said, and abruptly turned away. It was unforgivable. By the time the clock placed in the alcove of the adjoining hall strikes the next hour, I will definitely attain enlightenment. And show him. Once enlightened, I will enter his room again tonight, and I will exchange my enlightenment for the priest's head. If I do not attain enlightenment, I cannot take his life. I absolutely must attain enlightenment. I am a samurai. If I cannot attain enlightenment, I will commit seppuku. A samurai cannot live after being humiliated. I will die a clean death. As I thought this, my hand slipped under the cushion again without thinking. I dragged out a dagger in a red lacquered sheath. Gripping the hilt tightly, I cast off the red sheath, and the cold blade flashed all at once in the dark room. A dreadful energy seemed to escape from my hands with a hissing sound. Then, gathering entirely at the tip of the blade, the murderous intent converged into a single point. Seeing this sharp blade unfortunately compressed to the size of a needle's head, and unavoidably coming to a point at the tip of the 9½ sun blade, I suddenly felt the urge to plunge it into something. The blood in my body flowed toward my right wrist, and the hilt I was gripping grew sticky. My lips trembled. I returned the dagger to its sheath, drew it close to my right side, and then crossed my legs in the full lotus position. Joshu says, "Mu, nothingness." What is mu? Damn priest, I ground my teeth. Because I clenched my back teeth tightly, hot breath blew roughly from my nose. My temples were taut and aching. I opened my eyes twice as wide as usual. I could see the hanging scroll. I could see the paper lamp. I could see the tatami mats. I could vividly see the priest's bald, kettle-like head. I could even hear the voice that mocked me with its wide, crocodile-like mouth. What an insolent priest! I must take that kettle head at all costs. I will attain enlightenment. Mu, mu, I chanted at the root of my tongue. Even though I said mu, there was still the smell of incense. What is this? It's just incense. I suddenly clenched my fist and struck my own head as hard as I could. I ground my back teeth together. Sweat poured from both my armpits. My back became stiff as a board. The joints of my knees suddenly ached. I didn't care if my knees broke, but it hurt. It was agonizing. Mu just wouldn't come out. The moment I thought it was coming out, it immediately hurt. I was angry. I was filled with chagrin. I was incredibly frustrated. Tears fell in drops. I wanted to hurl my body against a huge rock and smash my bones and flesh to pieces in one go. Still, I endured it and sat completely still. I held back an agonizingly painful feeling, keeping it contained in my chest. That painful feeling lifted the muscles all over my body from below, desperate to burst out through the cores, but everywhere was completely blocked. A state of extreme cruelty with seemingly no exit. Eventually, my mind grew strange. The paper lamp, Buson's painting, the tatami mats, and the staggered shelves seemed to be there yet not there. Not there yet there. However, Mu did not manifest itself at all. It seemed I was just sitting there half-heartedly. Suddenly the clock in the next room began to chime ding. I gasped. My right hand immediately grabbed the dagger. The clock struck the second ding. Ten Nights of Dreams, The Third Night, by Natsume Soseki. I had a dream like this. I am carrying a 6-year-old child on my back. He is certainly my own child. But the strange thing is, at some point, his eyes have gone blind, and he has become a shaven-headed aobozu. When I asked, "When did your eyes go blind?" he replied, "Oh, a long time ago." His voice was unmistakably that of a child, but his manner of speaking was like that of an adult. Moreover, he spoke to me as an equal. On both sides are green rice fields. The path is narrow. Every now and then, the shadow of a heron flashes in the darkness. "We've reached the rice fields, haven't we?" he said from my back. "How do you know?" I asked, turning my face back toward him. "Because the herons are crying, aren't they?" he answered. And just then, A heron cried out twice. I began to feel a little afraid, even though he was my own child. I didn't know what would happen next if I kept carrying such a thing on my back. Looking ahead to see if there was somewhere I could abandon him, I saw a large forest in the darkness. Just as I started thinking that place would do, I heard a voice behind me. Hee hee. What are you laughing at? The child did not answer. He only asked, Father, am I heavy? You're not heavy. You'll find me heavy soon, he said. I walked on in silence, aiming for the forest. The path through the fields meandered irregularly, and I couldn't seem to get out as I wished. After a while, the path diverged into two. I stood at the fork and rested for a moment. There should be a stone standing here, the boy said. Sure enough, a stone about 8 inches square was standing there at waist height. On its face it said, left to Kubo, right to Hotahara. Even in the darkness, the red characters were clearly visible. The red characters were the color of a newt's belly. The left would be better, the boy commanded. Looking to the left, the forest from earlier cast its dark shadow from high in the sky over our heads. I hesitated for a moment. You don't need to hold back, the boy said again. I had no choice but to start walking toward the forest. While I was thinking to myself how well he knew everything despite being blind, as I approached the forest on the straight path, he said from my back, Blindness is really inconvenient, isn't it? That's why I'm carrying you, so it's fine, isn't it? I'm sorry for being carried, but it's terrible to be looked down upon by people. It's no good to be looked down upon, even by one's parents. I started to feel disgusted. I hurried, thinking I wanted to get to the forest quickly and abandon him. You'll understand if you go a little further. It was just such a night as this, he was saying to himself on my back. What was? I asked in a strained voice. What? You know perfectly well, the child answered mockingly. Then, I began to feel as if I did know, but I didn't understand it clearly. It only seemed as though it had been just such a night as this. And it seemed that if I went a little further, I would understand. It felt as though it would be terrible if I understood, so I felt I had to hurry and abandon him before I understood, to find peace of mind. I quickened my pace even more. Rain had been falling for some time. The path grew darker and darker. I was almost in a daze. Only the small boy was clinging to my back, and he was shining like a mirror that reflected my entire past, present, and future, without omitting a single fact. Moreover, he was my own child, and he was blind. I couldn't stand it anymore. It's here, right at the root of that cedar tree. In the rain, the boy's voice was clearly audible. Without realizing it, I had entered the forest. The black object about 6 feet ahead was certainly a cedar tree, just as the boy had said. Father, it was right at the root of that cedar tree, wasn't it? Yes, that's right, I answered in spite of myself. It was the year of the dragon, in the 5th year of Bunka, wasn't it? Sure enough, it seemed to me that it had been the year of the dragon, in the 5th year of Bunka. It was exactly 100 years ago today that you killed me, wasn't it? As soon as I heard these words, the realization suddenly arose in my head that 100 years ago, on just such a dark night as this, in the year of the dragon, in the 5th year of Bunka, I had killed a blind man at the root of this cedar tree. The moment I realized for the first time that I was a murderer, the child on my back suddenly became as heavy as a stone Jizo statue. 10 Nights of Dreams, Natsume Soseki, the fourth night. In the middle of the spacious dirt floor, a bench like a cooling stand was set up, and around it, small stools were lined up. The stand was gleaming with a dark luster. In a corner, an old man was drinking sake alone, with a square dining tray placed in front of him. The appetizer seemed to be simmered vegetables. The old man was quite red, depending on the effect of the sake. Moreover, his entire face was so glossy that nothing that could be called a wrinkle could be found anywhere. However, since he had grown as much white beard as possible, one could only tell that he was an old person. Even though I was a child, I wondered how old this old man was. Just then, the lady of the house, who had come drawing water into a wooden bucket from the bamboo pipe in the back, wiped her hands on her apron and asked, "How old are you, old man?" The old man swallowed the mouthful of simmered vegetables and coolly replied, "I've forgotten how old." The lady stood there, tucking her wiped hands into her narrow obi, looking at the old man's face from the side. The old man gulped down sake from something as large as a teacup, and then blew out a long breath through his white beard. Then the lady asked, "Where is your home, old man?" The old man cut his long breath short and said, "Deep inside the navel." The lady, with her hands still tucked into her narrow obi, asked again, "Where are you going?" Then the old man gulped down hot sake again from the large teacup-like vessel, blew out a breath, phew, just like before, and said, "I'm going over there." When the lady asked, "Straight ahead?" the breath he blew out passed right through the shoji screen, slipped under the willow tree, and went straight toward the riverbed. The old man went outside. I went out after him too. A small gourd was dangling from the old man's waist. He slung a square box from his shoulder under his armpit. He wore light blue long johns and a light blue sleeveless jacket. Only his tabi socks were yellow. They looked somewhat like tabi made of leather. The old man walked straight to the willow tree. There were 3 or 4 children under the willow tree. The old man pulled out a light blue hand towel from his waist. While laughing, he twisted it into a long, thin string like a paper cord. Then he placed it right in the middle of the ground. After that, he drew a large circle around the hand towel. Finally, he took out a brass candy seller's whistle from the box slung over his shoulder. "This hand towel will turn into a snake soon. So just watch. Just watch," he repeated. The children were intently watching the hand towel. I was watching it too, saying, just watch, all right?" The old man blew the whistle and started walking round and round the circle. I just kept looking at the hand towel. However, the hand towel didn't move at all. The old man blew the whistle. Peep, peep, and he went around the circle many times. He walked on his tiptoes in his straw sandals, moving stealthily, circling as if he were being cautious around the hand towel. It looked frightening. It also looked amusing. Before long, the old man suddenly stopped his whistle. Then he opened the lid of the box slung over his shoulder, pinched the neck of the hand towel lightly, and tossed it inside with a pop. "If I leave it like this, it will turn into a snake inside the box. I'll show it to you soon. I'll show it to you soon," the old man said, as he started walking straight ahead. He passed under the willow tree and went straight down the narrow path. Because I wanted to see the snake, I followed him down the narrow path as far as he went. The old man walked on, occasionally saying, "It's going to happen soon," or It's going to turn into a snake. In the end, he sang, "It will happen soon. It will become a snake. It will surely happen. The whistle will blow," and finally came out to the riverbank. Since there was neither a bridge nor a boat, I thought he would rest here and show the snake in the box. But the old man stepped splash splash right into the river. At first it was about knee-deep, but gradually the water covered his waist, then his chest, making him disappear from sight. Even so, the old man kept walking straight ahead endlessly, singing, "It gets deeper, it turns to night, it goes straight." And then his beard, his face, his head, and his hood completely disappeared from sight. Thinking that he would show the snake when he climbed up on the opposite bank, I stood where the reeds rustled, waiting all alone forever. However, the old man never came up after all. "10 Nights of Dreams." Natsume Soseki. The 5th night. I had a dream like this. It must have been a very long time ago, seemingly close to the age of the gods. I fought in a battle, and unfortunately losing, I was taken prisoner and brought before the enemy general. People in those days were all tall, and they all grew long beards. They wore leather belts, from which hung sword-like sticks. Their bows looked as if thick wisteria vines were used just as they were. They were neither lacquered nor polished. They were extremely simple things. The enemy general gripped the middle of his bow with his right hand, thrust the bow into the grass, and sat on something that looked like an overturned sake vat. Looking at his face, his thick left and right eyebrows connected above his nose. Of course, there were no such things as razors in those days. Since I was a captive, I could not sit on anything. I sat cross-legged on the grass. On my feet, I wore large straw boots. The straw boots of this era were deep. When standing, they reached up to the kneecaps. At their edges, a little straw was left unplaited, hanging down like tassels, making them flutter as one walked, serving as a decoration. The general looked at my face by the light of the bonfire and asked, "Die or live?" This was the custom at that time. Every captive was asked this at least once. Answering "live" meant surrender, while saying "die" meant refusing to submit. I answered with a single word, "Die." The general tossed the bow he had thrust into the grass away and smoothly began to draw the stick-like sword hanging at his waist. Just then, the wind-blown bonfire flared sideways at him. I opened my right hand like a maple leaf, turned my palm toward the general, and raised it above my eyes. The general slid the thick sword back into its sheath with a clack. Even in those days, there was love. I said I wanted to see the woman I loved one last time before I died. The general said he would wait until daybreak, until the rooster crowed. The woman had to be brought here before the rooster crowed. If the rooster crowed and the woman had not come, I would be killed without seeing her. The general remained seated, gazing at the bonfire. I remained sitting with my large straw boots crossed on the grass, waiting for the woman. The night gradually deepened. From time to time, there was the sound of the bonfire collapsing. Each time it collapsed, the flames seemed to tumble toward the general, as if in a panic. Under his pitch-black eyebrows, the general's eyes gleamed brightly. Then, someone would come and throw many fresh branches into the fire. After a while, the fire would crackle. It was a brave sound, as if repelling the darkness. At this time, the woman led out a white horse tied to the oak tree in the back. She stroked its mane 3 times and lightly leaped onto its high back. It was a barebacked horse with neither saddle nor stirrups. When she kicked its thick belly with her long white legs, the horse dashed off at full speed. Because someone had added light, the distant sky appeared faintly bright. The horse flew through the darkness, aiming for this brightness. It flew on, blowing 2 pillar-like breaths of fire from its nostrils. Even so, the woman continually kicked the horse's belly with her slender legs. The horse flew so fast that the sound of its hooves seemed to ring in mid-air. The woman's hair trailed in the darkness like a streamer, and yet she could not reach the place where the bonfire was. Then, by the side of the pitch-black road, the cry of a rooster suddenly rang out, "Cock-a-doodle-doo." Leaning backward, the woman pulled hard on the reins grasped in both hands. The horse fiercely struck its front hooves into the hard rock. "Cock-a-doodle-doo," the rooster crowed once more. The woman let out a gasp and released the tight reins all at once. The horse buckled at the knees. It plunged headlong forward, along with its rider. Below the rock was a deep abyss. The hoof prints still remain on the rock to this day. The one who mimicked the rooster's cry was the Amano-jaku. As long as these hoof prints remain carved into the rock, the Amano-jaku is my sworn enemy. Ten Nights of Dreams. Natsume Soseki. The 6th night. I heard a rumor that Unkei was carving Neo statues at the main gate of Gokokuji Temple. So I went there for a stroll. When I arrived, a large crowd had already gathered and was busily offering their opinions. In front of the gate, about 10 or 12 yards away, stood a large red pine. Its trunk stretched diagonally toward the distant blue sky, partially obscuring the tiles of the gate. The green of the pine and the vermilion lacquered gate looked beautiful together, reflecting each other's brilliance. It angled across the left side of the gate so as not to be an eyesore, widening as it went up until it projected over the roof, which gave it a somewhat old-fashioned air. One might have thought it was from the Kamakura period. However, the people watching were all people of the Meiji era, just like myself. Among them, rickshaw pullers were the most numerous. No doubt they were standing there because they were bored while waiting for fares. "It's a massive thing, isn't it?" one said. "Must be a lot more work than making a real human being," another remarked. Then another man said, "Well, so it's a Neo, is it? Do they still carve Neos even today?" "Is that so? I thought they were all just old ones." "He certainly looks strong," another man chimed in, addressing the others. "You can certainly say that again. They've always said that when it comes to strength, there's no one stronger than a Neo. They say he's even stronger than Yamato Takeru no Mikoto." This man had his kimono tucked up at the back and was hatless. He seemed quite uneducated. Unkei moved his chisel and mallet without paying the slightest attention to the onlookers' comments. He didn't look back even once. Perched high up, he worked intently on carving out the area around the Neo's face. Unkei wore a small cap resembling an eboshi on his head, and his large sleeves, whether they were from a suo robe or something else, I couldn't tell, were tied behind his back. His appearance was exceedingly archaic. He seemed completely out of place among the noisy onlookers. I wondered how Unkei could still be alive in this day and age.
While thinking what a strange thing it was, I remained standing there, watching. Unkei, however, seemed to feel nothing strange or odd at all, carving with all his might. A young man, who had been looking up at this scene, turned toward me and said, as expected of Unkei,
"His attitude says that the only heroes in this world are the Neo and himself. Truly admirable." I found these words interesting. When I glanced at the young man, he immediately added, "Look at how he uses that chisel and mallet. He has reached the wondrous realm of absolute mastery." Unkei had just carved a thick eyebrow horizontally, about an inch high. The moment he turned the blade of the chisel vertically, he struck the mallet down from an angle. He carved the hard wood in a single stroke, and just as the thick wood chips flew in response to the sound of the mallet, the side of an angry nose with flared nostrils suddenly emerged. The way he used the blade was truly unreserved. He seemed to harbor not a single doubt. It's amazing how he can carve such eyebrows and noses exactly as he wishes, with such effortless use of the chisel, I said, almost to myself, out of sheer admiration. Then the young man from before said, "No, he's not making the eyebrows and nose with the chisel. Those eyebrows and that nose are already buried inside the wood. He is simply digging them out with the power of the chisel and mallet. It's just like digging stones out of the earth, so there's no way he could ever go wrong." At that moment, for the first time, I remembered that that was what sculpture was, and it occurred to me that if that were the case, anyone could do it. Suddenly, wanting to carve a Neo myself, I stopped watching and hurried home. Taking a chisel and a hammer from my toolbox, I went out back. I found plenty of appropriately sized logs of oak that had been knocked down in a recent storm and had been sawn up by a woodcutter to be used as firewood. I chose the largest one and began carving with great spirit, but unfortunately, no Neo was to be found. With the next one, I also had the bad luck of failing to strike a Neo. There was no Neo in the third one either. I tried carving the logs in the pile one after another, but not a single one of them contained a Neo hidden inside. Finally, I realized that Neos are simply not buried in the wood of the Meiji era. And I also came to understand, more or less, the reason why Unkei has lived until this day. "10 Nights of Dreams," Natsume Soseki. The 7th night. I am on a large ship of some sort. Every day and every night, without the slightest pause, this ship spews black smoke and cuts through the waves as it moves forward. The noise is tremendous, yet I have no idea where it is going. All I know is that a sun, looking like a red-hot iron tong, emerges from the bottom of the waves. It reaches the very top of the tall mast and hangs there for a while. But before I know it, it overtakes our large ship and moves ahead. And finally, with a sizzle like a red-hot iron tong, it sinks back into the bottom of the waves. Every time this happens, the blue waves far off in the distance boil over in a deep crimson. Then the ship chases after its trail with a tremendous roar, but it never catches up. One day, I caught hold of one of the ship's crew and asked him, "Is this ship heading west?" The sailor looked puzzled. He stared at me for a while and eventually asked back, "Why?" "Because it seems to be chasing the setting sun." The sailor burst into loud laughter. Then he walked away, The end of the sun heading west. Is it the east? Is that true? The home of the sun rising in the east. Is it the west? Is that true too? We are but bodies on the waves. Let us drift, he chanted. I went to the bow and saw a large group of sailors gathered together, hauling in a thick halyard. I felt incredibly lonely and insecure. I didn't know when I would be able to go ashore, and I didn't know where we were going. The only certainty was that we were cutting through the waves, spewing black smoke. The waves were exceedingly vast. They looked limitlessly blue. Sometimes they turned purple. Only the area immediately around the moving ship was constantly foaming pure white. I felt overwhelmingly lonely. I thought I would rather throw myself overboard and die than stay on a ship like this. There were many passengers. Most of them appeared to be foreigners, but they had all sorts of faces. When the sky grew cloudy and the ship pitched, a woman leaned against the railing, weeping incessantly. The handkerchief she used to wipe her eyes looked white. However, she was wearing a Western-style dress that looked like printed cotton. When I saw this woman, I realized that I was not the only one who was sad. One evening, I went out on the deck and was looking at the stars alone, when a foreigner came up to me and asked if I knew anything about astronomy. Finding life meaningless, I was even contemplating death. I had no need to know about astronomy. I stayed silent. Then the foreigner told me a story about the 7 stars at the tip of Taurus. He said that the stars and the sea were all created by God. Finally, he asked me if I believed in God. I looked up at the sky and remained silent. Another time, I entered the saloon and saw a young woman in a flashy dress sitting with her back to me, playing the piano. Beside her stood a tall, fine-looking man, singing a song. His mouth looked incredibly large. Yet, the two of them seemed completely indifferent to anything other than themselves. They seemed to have even forgotten that they were on a ship. I felt more and more desolate. Finally, I made up my mind to die. And so, one night, when there was no one around, I took the plunge and jumped into the sea. However, the very moment my feet left the deck and my connection to the ship was severed, I suddenly found my life precious. From the bottom of my heart, I wished I hadn't done it. But it was too late. Willing or not, I had to enter the sea. Only the ship seemed to have been built very high. My body had left the ship, but my feet did not easily reach the water. However, having nothing to grab onto, I gradually drew closer to the water. No matter how much I pulled my legs up, the water came closer. The color of the water was black. Meanwhile, the ship passed by, spewing its usual black smoke. Realizing for the first time that it would have been better to stay on the ship, even one whose destination was unknown, and yet unable to act upon that realization, I fell quietly toward the black waves, embracing infinite regret and terror. Ten Nights of Dreams, Natsume Soseki, the 8th night. When I crossed the threshold of the barber shop, 3 or 4 men in white clothes, who had been gathered together, all said, "Welcome," at once. Standing in the middle and looking around, I saw it was a square room. Windows were open on 2 sides, and mirrors hung on the remaining 2. I counted the mirrors, and there were 6. I walked up to one of them and sat down. As I did, The seat made a soft, squishy sound. It was an exceptionally comfortable chair to sit in. My face was clearly reflected in the mirror. Behind my face, I could see the window. Then, I saw the lattice of the counter at an angle. There was no one inside the lattice. I could clearly see from the waist up the people passing by on the street outside the window. Shotaro passed by, accompanied by a woman. At some point, Shotaro had bought a Panama hat and was wearing it. As for the woman, I had no idea when he had found her. I really couldn't tell. Both of them looked quite proud of themselves. Before I could get a good look at her face, they had passed by. A tofu vendor passed by, blowing his horn. Because he had the horn pressed to his mouth, his cheeks were puffed out as if he had been stung by a bee. He passed by with his cheeks puffed out just like that, so it left me feeling incredibly anxious. I felt as though he would remain stung by a bee for the rest of his life. A geisha appeared. She hadn't put on her makeup yet. The base of her shimada hair bun was loose, making her head look somewhat untidy. Her face, too, looked half asleep. Her complexion was pitiably poor. She bowed and said, "Well, thank you for whatever." But the person she was speaking to simply would not appear in the mirror. Then a large man in white clothes came up behind me, holding scissors and a comb, and began to observe my head. I twisted my thin mustache and asked, "Well, will I amount to anything?" The man in white said nothing, but lightly tapped my head with the amber-colored comb in his hand. "Well, my head too. But what do you think? Will I amount to anything?" I asked the man in white. The man in white still answered nothing, and began to make a snip-snip sound with his scissors. I had intended to keep my eyes fixed on the mirror to catch every single reflection, but every time the scissors snipped, black hair came flying at me. I grew frightened and eventually closed my eyes. Then the man in white said this, "Sir, did you see the goldfish vendor out front?" I said I hadn't. The man in white said no more, and just kept snipping his scissors incessantly. Then suddenly there was a loud voice shouting, "Watch out!" Startled, I opened my eyes and saw the wheel of a bicycle beneath the sleeve of the man in white. I saw the shafts of a rickshaw. Just as I saw them, the man in white grabbed my head with both hands and firmly turned it to the side. The bicycle and the rickshaw vanished completely from sight. The sound of the scissors went snip, snip. Before long, the man in white moved to my side and began cutting around my ear. The hair was no longer flying forward, so I felt relieved and opened my eyes. "Millet, mochi, mochi, mochi," a voice called out right nearby. They were intentionally striking a small mallet against a mortar, keeping a rhythm as they pounded the mochi. I hadn't seen a millet mochi vendor since I was a child, so I wanted to get a little look at him. However, the millet mochi vendor simply would not appear in the mirror. Only the sound of mochi being pounded could be heard. Using all my visual strength, I peered intently into the corner of the mirror. Then, inside the lattice of the counter, a woman was sitting there before I knew it. She was a large woman with a darkish complexion and thick eyebrows. Her hair was tied in a ginkgo leaf style, and she wore a plain kimono with a black satin collar. With one knee raised, she was counting bills. The bills seemed to be 10-yen notes. The woman cast down her long eyelashes, pressed her thin lips together, and was desperately counting the bills, and her way of counting was incredibly fast. Yet, no matter how far she went, the number of bills showed no sign of running out. There were at most 100 or so bills resting on her lap, but no matter how long she counted them, that 100 remained 100. I stared in a daze at this woman's face and the 10-yen bills. Then, right by my ear, the man in white said in a loud voice, "Let's wash." It was just the right moment, so the instant I stood up from the chair, I turned and looked toward the counter's lattice. However, neither the woman, nor the bills, nor anything else could be seen inside the lattice. I paid the fee and went outside. On the left side of the entrance, about 5 oval-shaped tubs were lined up, and inside them were many red goldfish, mottled goldfish, thin goldfish, and fat goldfish. The goldfish vendor rested his chin in his hands, perfectly still, staring fixedly at the goldfish lined up in front of him. He paid almost no mind to the noisy activity of the street. I stood for a while, gazing at this goldfish vendor. But for as long as I gazed at him, the goldfish vendor didn't move a single inch. Ten Nights of Dreams. Natsume Soseki. The 9th night. The world had somehow begun to grow restless. It looked as though a war could break out at any moment. I had the feeling that barebacked horses, driven out by fires, were running wild around the mansion day and night, chased incessantly by throngs of shouting foot soldiers. And yet, inside the house, it was dead silent. In the house lived a young mother and her 3-year-old child. The father had gone somewhere. It was in the middle of a moonless night that the father went away. He put on his straw sandals right on the raised floor, pulled a black hood over his head, and went out through the back door. The light of the paper lantern the mother was holding cast a long, narrow beam into the dark night, illuminating an old cypress tree standing just before the hedge. The father never returned after that. Every day the mother would ask her 3-year-old child, "Where is your father?" The child said nothing. After a while, the child began to answer, "Over there." Even when the mother asked, "When is he coming back?" the child would still just answer, "Over there," and laugh. At those times, the mother laughed too. Then she repeatedly taught the child the words, "He will be back soon." However, the child only learned the word soon. Sometimes when asked, "Where is your father?" the child would answer, "Soon." When night fell and everything grew quiet, the mother would retighten her sash, slip a short sword with a sharkskin sheath into it, strap the child to her back with a narrow sash, and slip quietly out through the side gate. The mother always wore sandals. Sometimes the child would fall asleep on her back, listening to the sound of these sandals. Heading west, down the samurai district, lined with earthen walls, and reaching the bottom of a long, gentle slope, there stood a large ginkgo tree. Turning right at this ginkgo tree, about 100 yards down, there was a stone torii gate. The path to the gate had rice fields on one side, and a dense patch of bare bamboo on the other. Passing through the torii gate, one entered a dark grove of cedar trees. Following the paving stones for about 40 yards to the end, one arrived at the foot of the stairs to an old shrine worship hall. Above the faded grey offering box hung a thick rope for a large bell. If one looked during the day, next to that bell was a plaque that read, "Hachiman Shrine." Interestingly, the character for Hachi was written in a stylized font that looked like 2 doves facing each other. There were various other plaques as well. Most of them featured a golden bullseye pierced by an arrow, accompanied by the name of the samurai who shot it. Occasionally, there were also dedicated longswords. Once through the torii gate, an owl could always be heard hooting in the cedar treetops, and the cold sandals made a picha-picha slapping sound. When the sound stopped in front of the worship hall, the mother would first ring the bell, then immediately crouch down and clap her hands in prayer. Usually, at this exact moment, the owl would suddenly stop hooting. Then, the mother would pray fervently for her husband's safety. In the mother's mind, since her husband was a samurai, if she made an earnest vow here to Hachiman, the god of bow and arrow, there was no reason her prayers would go unheard. She believed this with all her heart. The child would often wake up at the sound of the bell, and seeing total darkness all around, would suddenly start crying on her back. At those times, the mother, while muttering prayers under her breath, would sway her back to soothe the child. Sometimes this worked, and the child would stop crying. Other times, the child would cry even harder. In either case, the mother would not easily stand up. Once she finished praying for her husband's well-being, she would untie the narrow sash, slide the child down from her back to the front, and cradling the child in both arms, she would climb the steps of the worship hall. "Be a good child. Wait here just a little while," she would say, firmly pressing her cheek against the child's. Then she would lengthen the narrow sash, tie it around the child, and fasten the other end to the railing of the worship hall. After that, she would come down the steps and walk back and forth along the paving stones, performing her 100-fold visits to the shrine. The child, tied to the worship hall, would crawl around on the veranda in the dark, as far as the length of the sash allowed. On those occasions, it was a very easy night for the mother. But when the tied child wailed and cried, she was beside herself with worry. Her pace during the 100-fold visits would become incredibly fast. She would be completely out of breath. When there was no other way, she would go up to the worship hall in the middle of her prayers, coax and soothe the child in various ways, and then start her 100-fold visits all over again. The father, for whom the mother had agonized for countless nights, losing sleep out of worry, had actually been killed by wandering samurai a long time ago. I heard this sad story from my mother in a dream. Ten Nights of Dreams by Natsume Soseki. The 10th night. Ken-san came to inform me that Shotaro, who had been abducted by a woman, wandered back on the 7th night, suddenly developed a fever, and collapsed into bed. Shotaro is the most handsome man in town, and an exceedingly good-natured, honest fellow. He has only one pastime. In the evening, wearing his Panama hat, he sits at the front of the fruit shop and gazes at the faces of the women passing by. And he constantly admires them. Other than that, he has no particular defining traits to speak of. When not many women are passing by, he looks at the fruit instead of the street. There are various kinds of fruit. Peaches, apples, loquats, and bananas are beautifully arranged in baskets, lined up in 2 rows so they can be readily taken as gifts. Looking at these baskets, Shotaro remarks on how beautiful they are. He says that if one is to do business, a fruit shop is the only way to go. Despite this, he himself just wears his Panama hat and idles his time away. He sometimes critiques things like summer oranges, saying, "This color is nice." However, he has never once taken out money to actually buy any fruit. Of course, he doesn't eat them for free either. He only praises their colors.
One evening, a woman suddenly stood at the storefront. She wore splendid clothes, appearing to be a person of high status. The color of her kimono greatly pleased Shotaro. Furthermore, Shotaro was incredibly taken by the woman's face. So he took off his precious Panama hat, greeted her politely, and when the woman pointed to the largest fruit basket and said, "I'll take this," Shotaro immediately grabbed the basket and handed it to her. The woman then lifted it slightly and said, "Being naturally a man of leisure and an extremely agreeable fellow," Shotaro said, "Then I shall carry it to your home," and left the fruit shop together with the woman. And he never returned after that. People were saying that even for Shotaro, this was too careless. And just as his relatives and friends were starting to make a fuss, fearing something serious had happened, he wandered back on the evening of the 7th day. When a large crowd gathered around him and asked, "Sho-san, where have you been?" Shotaro replied that he had taken a train to the mountains. According to Shotaro, as soon as he got off the train, he emerged onto a field. It was an incredibly vast field, and everywhere he looked, there was nothing but green grass growing. Walking on the grass with the woman, he suddenly came out to the top of a steep cliff. At that moment, the woman said to Shotaro, "Try jumping down from here." Peering down, he could see the cliff face, but he could not see the bottom. Shotaro once again took off his Panama hat and repeatedly declined. The woman then asked if it was all right with him to be licked by pigs if he couldn't bring himself to jump. Shotaro absolutely hated pigs and Kumoemon. However, thinking he could not trade his life for it, he still held back from jumping. Just then, a pig came up, grunting. Left with no choice, Shotaro struck the pig's snout with the thin betel palm walking stick he was carrying. Letting out a grunt, the pig tumbled backwards and fell down the cliff. Just as Shotaro breathed a sigh of relief, another pig came to rub its large snout against him. Reluctantly, Shotaro raised his stick again. The pig grunted and tumbled headlong into the bottom of the pit once more. At this point, Shotaro suddenly noticed something, and looking off into the distance, from the far end where the green plain met the horizon, tens of thousands of countless pigs were forming a herd, marching in a straight line, grunting as they headed straight for Shotaro, standing on top of the cliff. Shotaro was truly appalled from the bottom of his heart, but having no other choice, he carefully struck the snouts of the approaching pigs one by one with his betel palm stick. Strangely enough, if the stick merely touched their noses, the pigs would tumble down to the bottom of the valley. Peering down, he saw a procession of upside-down pigs falling down the bottomless cliff. Thinking about how many pigs he had dropped into the valley, Shotaro became afraid of himself. And yet, the pigs kept coming one after another. As if dark clouds had grown legs, they came pushing through the green grass with tremendous momentum, grunting inexhaustibly. Mustering desperate courage, Shotaro struck the pigs' snouts for 7 days and 6 nights. But eventually, his energy ran out, his hands grew as weak as konjac, and in the end, he was licked by the pigs. Ken-san told Shotaro's story up to this point, and then said, "So it's not good to look at women too much." I also thought he was right. However, Ken-san was also saying that he wanted Shotaro's Panama hat. Shitara will probably not survive. The Panama hat will likely belong to Ken-san.
Thank you for watching until the end. How did you like the continuous screening of Natsume Soseki's 10 Nights of Dreams? By listening to all the nights connected together, you may have seen a landscape that you had never seen before. Which night resonated with you the most? Please let us know in the comments section. This channel will continue to deliver the deep darkness and beauty of literature. We would be happy if you subscribe to the channel and look forward to our next journey. Until then, see you again.